There is a word in Matthew 11:28 that almost every English reader hears in the wrong key. The word is yoke. It appears in verse 29 when Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you." But the yoke he is talking about is not a general metaphor for submission. It is a direct, polemical jab aimed at the men standing in the crowd listening to him, the Pharisees and scribes who had spent years binding people with a yoke they themselves would not lift a finger to move. And the invitation, "Come to me, all who are weary," is not a gentle, open-armed offer. It is a military-style defection call, a summons to leave one master for another. The moment you read the verse in its immediate context, the entire tone shifts. It is not the sound of a pastor at a bedside. It is the sound of a general calling soldiers out of a losing army. The first thing to notice is the word weary in Greek. It is *kopio*. This is not the ordinary word for being tired. *kopio* means to be utterly exhausted, worn down to the bone from strenuous labor. In the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, *kopio* is used for the grinding toil of slaves and the desperate labor of those who have nothing left. But in the Gospel of Matthew, the word has a specific fingerprint. Just 2 chapters earlier in Matthew 9:37, Jesus says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few." The word for laborers there is *ergatai* workers. But the word for the exhaustion of those workers is *kopio*. The harvest is pressing, and there are not enough people to bring it in. The workers are collapsing under the pressure. Now in chapter 11, Jesus turns to the crowd and uses the same root word. The weariness he addresses is not the normal wear and tear of life. It is the specific exhaustion of people who have been told that the way to God is through endless, meticulous, exhausting performance. That exhaustion has a name, and the name is Pharisaic religion. The Pharisees had built a system that made the law into a fortress. They added fence after fence around each commandment: "Do not work on the Sabbath." And to ensure you do not work, here are 39 categories of forbidden labor. "Do not covet." And to ensure you do not covet, here are 100 rules about what you may look at. The system was not malicious, it was designed to protect the law. But the effect was that ordinary people, farmers, fishermen, tax collectors, could never be sure they had kept it all. They were always one step behind, always carrying a burden that the religious experts themselves did not have to carry because the experts had the time and education to navigate the walls. This is why Jesus, just a few verses earlier in the same chapter, pronounces woe on the cities that rejected him and then, in verse 25, prays, "I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent and have revealed them to infants." The wise and intelligent are the Pharisees and their scribes. The infants are the exhausted, the heavy laden, the ones crushed by a system they were never designed to carry. Which means that verse 28 is not a general offer to every person who feels tired. It is a specific offer to people who have been crushed by a particular kind of religious burden. And that is a very different thing. The person who reads this verse and assumes it is a blanket promise for anyone having a bad week is missing the sharp edge of the text. The verse is a rescue mission, not an app. Jesus is saying, "The system that has worn you out was never mine. Come out of it, leave it. I offer something else entirely." Now here is where the text gets even more uncomfortable. Immediately after the invitation to rest, Jesus uses the word yoke. "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me." The natural reaction is confusion. You just promised rest. Now you are putting a yoke on me. That feels like the exact opposite of rest. The crowd listening to Jesus would have felt that tension sharply, because in their world, a yoke was not a warm, fuzzy image. It was a piece of farming equipment that meant work. Slaves wore yokes. Oxen wore yokes. The yoke was the thing that made you pull. And here Jesus offers a yoke as the answer to exhaustion. That is not a comfortable juxtaposition. It is a deliberate paradox. The open loop here is wide open, and the text does not resolve it immediately. Jesus does not say, "Take my yoke, and then later you will find rest." He says, "Take my yoke, and you will find rest for your souls." Rest is not the cessation of the yoke. Rest is the yoke itself. Which means that whatever Jesus means by yoke, it is not the same kind of yoke the Pharisees were offering. The word yoke in Jewish tradition was also a term for a teacher's interpretation of the law. You would take upon yourself the yoke of the Torah, meaning you submitted to its authority. Every rabbi had a yoke. The Pharisees' yoke was a system of endless fences and hidden traps. Jesus' yoke is something entirely different. But the difference is not that one is a yoke and the other is not. The difference is what the yoke demands and what the yoke gives. The person reading this at home or in an office or in a hospital room needs to feel the weight of that distinction, because the modern church has its own versions of the Pharisaic yoke. It may not come in the form of Sabbath rules or dietary laws, but it comes in the form of unspoken standards. You must attend every service, serve in every ministry, read every chapter, pray every hour, and if you miss one, you are somehow less faithful. That yoke produces the same exhaustion Jesus saw in the crowds of Galilee. And the invitation, "Come to me," is not permission to stop doing everything. It is permission to stop doing everything that does not come from Him. That is a far more demanding invitation than it sounds, because it requires you to learn how to distinguish between the yoke you were given by religion and the yoke that Jesus actually gives. And the only way to learn that is to wear His yoke, not just to set yours down. The historical context of this passage makes the invitation even sharper. Jesus had just finished a devastating critique of the cities that rejected Him: Chorazin, Bethsaida, Capernaum. He compared them to Tyre and Sidon, two pagan cities that would have repented if they had seen His miracles. Then He turns to the Father in prayer, and then He turns to the crowd. The sequence matters. Jesus is not softening after the judgment. He is offering refuge to those who are fleeing the judgment of the system. The Pharisees and their followers had rejected the way of Jesus. The cities had rejected the way of Jesus. But the weary and heavy laden, the ones who were not wise or intelligent by the world's standard, these were the ones who would come. And they would come not because they understood everything, but because they had nothing left but to come. The Greek word for heavy laden is *pefortismenoi*. It is a perfect passive participle. That grammatical form means the action was done to them by someone else. They have been loaded down. They did not choose it. They did not earn it. It was placed on them. That is the crowd Jesus is addressing. Not the people who have light burdens they could set down if they wanted to. The people who are carrying weight that was forced onto them. That weight came from the Pharisees, from the system, from 1,000 small messages that said God is pleased with the perfectly observant and disappointed with everyone else. And Jesus looks at that crowd and says, in effect, the weight you are carrying was never mine. Put it down and pick up my weight instead. And that last sentence, "pick up my weight instead," is exactly where the tension lies. Because the invitation is not an invitation to carry nothing. It is an invitation to carry something different. And that difference is what the next verse begins to explain. But the explanation is not what most people expect. The explanation is not what most people expect, because the verse that follows the invitation does not describe a life free of demands. It describes a yoke. And the word yoke carries with it the full weight of everything Jesus has been arguing against. The Pharisees had a yoke. Every rabbi had a yoke. The yoke was the teaching, the interpretation of Torah that you submitted to. So when Jesus says, "Take my yoke upon you," He is not abandoning the image of religious submission. He is redefining what submission looks like. And the redefinition begins with the word learn. Learn from me, He says. The Greek word is *manthano*, from which we get mathematics and discipline. It does not mean to passively absorb information. It means to apprentice yourself to a master, to watch his hands, to copy his movements, to submit to his training until his reflexes become your reflexes. Jesus is not offering a lecture series. He is offering an apprenticeship. The first thing every apprentice must learn is the character of the master. And Jesus immediately gives the reason His yoke is different, for I am gentle and humble in heart. The word for gentle is *praus*. It is not weakness. In the Greek world, *praus* described a horse that had been broken to the bridle, still powerful, but no longer wild, no longer dangerous to its rider. It was strength under perfect control. The humility Jesus speaks of is not self-deprecation. It is the humility of a king who does not need to prove his authority. He already has it. And because he has nothing to prove, he does not need to crush those beneath his yoke. The Pharisees' yoke was built on the anxiety of performance. You must do more, be more, measure up. Jesus' yoke is built on the confidence of the one who already knows his Father's approval. And that difference changes everything about the burden. The rest Jesus promises is not the cessation of labor. It is the cessation of anxiety about the labor. The person who wears the right yoke stops asking, "Am I doing enough?" Because the master decides what is enough. The apprentice simply does what the master says, in the way the master shows, at the pace the master sets. And the master in this case is gentle and humble. He does not drive the ox beyond its strength. He fits the yoke to the animal. In fact, the image of a custom yoke would have been immediately understood by anyone who worked with oxen. A yoke that fits poorly chafes and bruises. A A yoke fitted precisely to the animal's shoulders spreads the load evenly and makes heavy work feel manageable. Jesus is saying, the yoke I give you is not generic. It is made for you. The Pharisees gave everyone the same set of rules. Jesus gives each disciple a tailored obedience. That does not mean the obedience is easier. It means it is possible. Here the modern reader must stop and feel the weight of that distinction, because the typical way this passage is preached reduces it to a promise of emotional relief. Come to Jesus and your stress will melt away. But that is not what the text says. The text says, come to Jesus and take his yoke. The rest comes from the yoke, not from the absence of it. Which means that the person who has left a legalistic church but never taken up the yoke of Christ has not yet found rest. They have only traded one burden for another, the burden of trying to earn God's favor for the burden of trying to manufacture their own meaning. The yoke is non-negotiable. The only question is whose yoke you wear. Jesus deepens this in the next phrase, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. The word easy in Greek is *Christos*, which does not mean simple or undemanding. It means well-fitting, serviceable kind. It is the same root word that describes Jesus' character in the Gospels, the kindness of God that leads to repentance. The yoke is easy because it fits. The burden is light because the one who carries it is not carrying it alone. The word light is *Elaphras*, which is used in the Septuagint to describe the burden of the Lord in contrast to the crushing weight of Egyptian slavery. The Exodus generation knew the difference between a burden that destroys and a burden that builds. Jesus is drawing that same contrast. The Pharisees' religion was Egypt. His apprenticeship is the wilderness journey, still hard, still long, but carrying with it the presence of the one who leads. But there is a deeper layer that most readers miss entirely. The phrase "learn from me" echoes the wisdom tradition of Proverbs and Sirach, where the sage invites the student to take up the yoke of wisdom. In Sirach 51, the wise man says, "Put your neck under her yoke and let your soul receive instruction." The yoke of wisdom was a standard image, but wisdom was abstract. Jesus personalizes it. He is not teaching a system. He is teaching himself. The yoke is not a set of rules, but a relationship. And that relationship is what makes the burden light, not because the demands are fewer, but because the one who demands is with you in the demand. The law was given from Sinai, from a distance. Jesus gives himself from Galilee, from the middle of the crowd. Now the historical context adds another sharp edge. In Jewish tradition, the phrase yoke of the kingdom of heaven referred to the recitation of the Shema and the acceptance of God's reign. To take on the yoke of the kingdom meant to declare God as your king and to submit to his law. But the Pharisees had defined that submission in terms of endless observance. Jesus offers his own interpretation of the kingdom, and he does so with an authority that the Pharisees could not claim. He does not say, "Follow the Torah as I explain it." He says, "Follow me. I am the Torah. Learn from me." That is an enormous claim. It is the claim of the one who, in Matthew's Gospel, has already been called Emmanuel, God with us. The yoke of the kingdom is not an abstraction. It is the person of Jesus himself. And the rest he offers is not a vacation from obedience. It is the rest of knowing that your obedience is held by someone who will never fail to complete what he has begun. The tension that remains for the viewer is this: if the yoke is so well-fitting, why do so many people who claim to wear it still feel exhausted? The answer is that they may be wearing the wrong yoke without knowing it. The yoke of legalism is obvious. But there is another yoke that masquerades as grace, the yoke of cheap discipleship. The yoke that says Jesus did everything so you can do nothing. That yoke also chafes because it leaves the soul without direction, without growth, without the satisfaction of meaningful work. The soul was made for a yoke. The question is not whether you will carry one, but whose you will carry. And the modern church has offered both extremes without offering the center. The Pharisees offered a yoke that crushed. The antinomians offer a yoke that dissolves. Jesus offers a yoke that builds. This is where the passage lands with its full weight. Jesus does not end the invitation by saying, "And then you will never work again." He ends by saying, "And you will find rest for your souls." That is a direct quotation from Jeremiah 6:16, where the Lord says, "Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths, ask where the good way is, and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls." But the people of Jeremiah's day said, "We will not walk in it." Jesus is reopening that ancient path. He is the good way. And the rest he offers is not the end of movement, it is the discovery that the path you are walking is the one you were made for. The yoke is not the obstacle to rest. The yoke is the rest. Because when the yoke fits, every step forward is a step into the rhythm of the one who walks beside you. The final truth of this passage is not that Jesus makes life easy. It is that he makes life possible. The weariness of the Pharisees was the weariness of trying to reach God through human effort. The weariness of the modern soul is the same whether through religion, achievement, or the desperate search for meaning. Jesus does not say stop trying. He says try me. He says take my yoke, learn my rhythm, trust that I know what you can carry. And the rest that comes is not the absence of the load. It is the presence of the one who shares it. The yoke is still there. The field is still there. The day's work is still ahead. But the hands holding the plow are not your own. They are the hands that were nailed to a cross and are now open to receive you. That is the rest the world cannot give and cannot take away.